Coming up on Chopper's Political Podcast.
Then we're a rule taker, not rule maker.
Well, then that comes back to more complicated issues. And you know my views, we shouldn't have left.
Welcome back to Chopper's Political Podcast, where I bring you the best guests, gossip, news and stories from our studio at GB News here in the heart of Westminster. This week, the King and Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer rolled out the red carpet for France's Emmanuel Macron on the first state visit by an EU leader since Brexit way back in 2016. It was the latest effort by the Labour government to get closer to our closest neighbour on the continent of Europe as ministers continue to battle with their number one issue, well, their joint number one issue anyway, the small boats crisis. Boats of migrants coming across the English Channel into southern England. So this week I'll be discussing whether we move on from what I would say is the love-hate relationship with France and create a new bond with our neighbours across La Manche. Or is it time just to say and accept that we are different? Vive la différence, as they might say in France. Is it time for a new relation politique? That means special relationship in French for my two worker bees in the studio, George and Rebecca. I'll be speaking later to Dominic Grieve. He's a former Tory cabinet minister, a proud Rayner, and is president also of the Franco-British Society and a recipient of the Légion d'honneur, France's highest accolade, civil or military, awarded very rarely to Brits like Dominic Grieve for his work on UK-French relations. Also discussing with Dominic a new review he's chairing on the definition of Islamophobia, and whether that should be written into law, a controversial issue set to rear its head this autumn. I'm also joined the podcast by Richard Holden, the Tory MP for Basildon and Billericay and a former Tory party chairman. He'll be talking to us about why he thinks it's important to get to grips with first cousin marriage and its links, some would say, to the grooming gangs scandal. But first to France, and a visit this week of Emmanuel Macron, the French president. Is it time to reset how we view France, our nearest neighbour, in a post-Brexit world? With me to debate that is Dominic Grieve, the president of the Franco-British Society and one of the few Brits, as I say, to receive the Légion d'honneur. Dominic Grieve, welcome to Chopper's Political Podcast. It's an honour to have you here, Dominic Grieve.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
And how do you get the Légion d'honneur? That's the highest accolade, I think.
I got it for being president of the Franco-British Society.
Because it matters, the relationship matters to France.
Well, it does matter. And it's also worth bearing in mind that the King is the patron of the Franco-British Society. So actually, it also matters at the United Kingdom end. And I wouldn't have got the Legion of Honour unless somebody had asked the UK government whether they could give it to me.
And why it matters. It's fascinating you say the King there, because I think the King is leading, in a way, this. Let me finish my argument. I think he's leading the politicians on this. I noted when the ship Agincourt was renamed recently into a not a French battle name. I just sense the King is quite pro closer ties with Europe, and he's part of this. What do you think?
I think the King is very savvy when it comes to understanding where UK's national interests lie. In fairness, he's also assiduous in trying to maintain our alliance with the United States at a time of strain. But I think he also sees the relationship between the United Kingdom and France as being very important, as indeed with all our European partners. They are, after all, our neighbourhood. So you look at in his time as Prince of Wales, and you can see there are a number of things which seem to be of importance to him. And the United Kingdom in its setting and its region is, I think, one of those.
And that's what maybe the monarch should do, sit above the politics, putting all the difficulties about Brexit or small boats and all the kind of prickly relationship we have with France, which we'll come on to, and try and see the kind of the bigger picture, maybe.
Yes, and I agree with that. And after all, the King is, but he's not going to act contrary to the wishes of his politicians.
No, I'm not saying
so.
That.
He will always do. But the great merit of the UK monarchy is it adds a huge amount of added value.
Yes,
to our diplomacy, to our international engagement, and you can see that happening all the time. And I'm sure we've watched this happen.
Yes,
during this visit.
Since Sir Keir Starmer became Prime Minister, he is stressed the need for bilateral relationships. He's done a visit to Paris. I've been with him. I went to the British Embassy in France, which you never went to in Brexit days because we didn't have that same relationship. We went to Brussels only. So now we're forging relationships with individual countries as best we can. And he gets on quite well with Macron, doesn't he?
He seems to get on very well with him. And Macron's been around a long time. And yes, the relationship looks a good one. And I think the king probably enjoys going to France. So all those things taken together, it's quite a good recipe for improving Franco-British relations.
Because they haven't been great. I mean, there was a time when the Conservative leader who became a prime minister wasn't sure if France was an enemy or not. Do you remember that during?
Well, that was one of the weirder statements I've ever heard from a Conservative prime minister. And the reality is we've been at peace with France since 1815.
Yes.
We have a very close relationship. Our defence relationship in the 20th century has always been close, despite the difficulties of the Second World War and France's defeat at the start of it. Britain has upheld French interests at a time when France was, frankly, on the ground in the Second World War, and particularly against the United States, who might have just relegated France to being a third world power. And we have, on so many multiple levels, a good relationship. Our defence relationship is no longer just dependent on politicians. It is taking place on a daily basis in exchanges of military personnel, in cooperation for defending our common European space, the Atlantic approaches, monitoring the Russians, and we have a good intelligence sharing relationship as well. Not the same as the Five Eyes, but nevertheless.
And why isn't it that, though? Why don't we have the special relationship, to use my appalling French? Well, why don't we have a similar version of that, given it's our closest neighbour? It's a member of the UN Security Council. It's a member of the G7, obviously.
It's the obvious place to go.
So why do we rely on Five Eyes? We should explain probably briefly.
Well, Five Eyes is United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and ourselves, and we have an intelligence sharing relationship which is very deep, and we have a whole series of agreements. And it's very
with France.
Well, we don't. But on the other hand, we share a lot with France anyway. Yes, you could progress that. I think that one of the issues for the French is France is a leading power within the European Union. And some issues France wishes to see discussed at European Union level, whereas we would prefer to see them now discussed bilaterally because we're no longer in the EU. I don't want to revisit Brexit, but Brexit has complicated the relationship very much. And it also introduced what always happens in divorce, which is that people become emotional and at times they behave badly towards each other because of that emotion. But we're over that. So one's got to look at the positives. They are our fourth largest trading partner on planet Earth. We export over 100 billion a year in goods and services. They are our second exporters for services. And we cooperate together on energy, particularly. Indeed, our single biggest export of goods is energy related.
EDF is investing here.
And EDF relates. And we sell generators. So, I mean, it's a single biggest item that goes out from the UK to France. So, and pre-Brexit, there was at SME level, small and medium enterprise level, multiple examples of people who are exporting and sending goods to France and trading in France, just as if it was the same as sending something 60 miles away in the UK.
And we're trying to get back to that as a country, aren't we?
Well, it would be good to get back to it. And that, I'm afraid, raises the issue of phytosanitary alignment, because a lot of this related to agricultural produce. Cheeses and things like that. So it would be nice to see that progress. I think the French are well disposed towards us. I think they recognise that even out of the EU, we have a very important contribution to make to European security, and that actually drawing us back into European economic activities, even if we're outside, is ultimately in their own national.
So it's time to maybe rethink this relationship and in a post-Brexit world, maybe go back to where the trading relationship which we got into back in the common market.
Well, because that might well be
that real trading Brexit. The sovereignty row, I think, was the issue which polluted the idea of a trading relationship.
It did, and one of the issues is, can we move to sectoral agreements like the Swiss? Although the EU doesn't like that, but clearly, if we were to do sectoral agreements, that would be an enormously advantage to our trading relationship with France.
Then we're a rule taker, not rule maker.
Well, then that comes back to more complicated issues. know my views. We shouldn't have left.
Yes, indeed. But we have moved on. Even this government now, this Remainer-led government, believes that we are where we are. So we are where we are. Why do we seem to rub up against each other so much? Is it a cultural thing? Is it time to just grow up as a country? The media, the way that we, do you know what I mean? There is this kind of, what is it? How do you describe it?
We have. It's a complex relationship because historically, if you look back over 1,000 years, we are completely interconnected and enmeshed, and not only in terms of proximity, monarchy, culture. I think people ignore this, but nevertheless, it's right that in the period after the Reformation and from only the late 17th century to 1815, there was 125 years of intense international rivalry as both countries were striving to become great world powers. And that is pretty well imprinted in the DNA. And you can argue that the UK ultimately didn't make any difference, but you could argue the UK won that contest. But despite that, it didn't give us power over the French.
Yes.
But it has left a legacy of rivalry, and the two countries are so similar. We're similar in population, with a million or two. Our GDP per capita is sometimes ours is a bit higher, sometimes theirs. We're a much smaller country than France, so there are some differences geographically. But that having been said, we are, in many ways, not identical twins, but twins.
Yeah.
And that creates, I think, the rivalry.
We look in the mirror and we see each other, don't we? Could the Tories have done this? I mean, by that I mean this reach out to the French government, which has been going on, I think, now under Keir Starmer a few.
I think it's easier under Starmer because Starmer is untainted with Brexit.
Yes.
On the other hand, I don't think Rishi Sunak was having too much difficulty rebuilding links with Macron, and I think the French government has always clearly thinks that Brexit was a terrible UK error, which they may chortle over their coffee. But that having been said, they also value the relationship, and they will work with any mainstream political party in government that wishes to further that relationship. And the relationship, the defence relationship wasn't affected by Brexit at all.
But that's just too important to deal with with rows about Brexit. The big issue at the moment is the small boats crisis. We're seeing it on our TV screens nightly. At GB News, the viewers and listeners are appalled by it. I think the government is appalled by it. We have given hundreds of millions of pounds to France. It hasn't stopped it, has it? I mean,
I think one has to recognise that the French, they operate within a legal framework just as we do. So I don't think that their problems are simply just ones of we couldn't care less about this. I do think they could do more. I think that the signs that they're now prepared to burst some of the boats when they're already when they're already in the water is a good sign, and it must ultimately be in their interests, because as long as this route continues to operate, they are going to get a concentration of desperate people coming in northern France, which is causing them a lot of difficulty. And as that is never going to be cleared by somehow getting more people into the United Kingdom, it's in everybody's interest that we work together to try to, firstly, prevent the crossings, and then secondly, to try to pinch off the problem much closer to its source. That needs cooperation at an EU level, and I don't think we can ignore the fact that simply cooperating with France over that is not going to solve our problem.
We can't do that, those deals anymore because of the nature of the European Union. I didn't know why the French police intervened on that single boat with the BBC cameras filming last Friday. I think they may have seen a young girl on the boat. I think what they can do is that if a young child's in danger...
I think they considered that the boat was unseaworthy, and therefore if it went out to sea, there was going to be a tragedy in the water. So that was the basis for doing it. But certainly if they could stop more of the boats leaving the beaches or immediately puncture them when they're just about to do so, it will close down. Ultimately, if people can't get across, they won't come to northern France.
Yes, we'll wait and see how that one plays out. And we have our faces turned, don't we, in this country, to the US and Donald Trump and like. Perhaps we should look more at France. I mean, we don't do it enough, do we? We view it as a foreign country, whereas France is viewed as a sister country.
Yeah, and I think that's a language issue. And also, France is we think the US is very familiar, although people who go to the United States realize that it's in fact another world.
I 100% agree with that.
A comment which Churchill made to de Gaulle in one of their conversations as a record, saying they both agreed the United States was another world as far as the conversation.
Separated by the same language. Yeah.
Whereas the French are in fact very similar to us, but there are some superficial differences. And people find French society quite difficult to understand and get into. Although actually I think that's changing, because France of 2025 is not the same as France of 1980, or certainly not of 1950. And the way, the ease of relationships and the sorts of lifestyles led by young people is significantly more relaxed and less formal than it was. Whereas France always came across to Brits as being a rather formal country. And indeed, there was some truth in that, because until you had gone through the formalities, you weren't likely to establish a relationship. You only have to look at the way they address each other, or did, monsieur et madame, sir and madam.
Tutoyer.
And also the question of whether you use a vous voyez or tutoyer, whether you're these are quite complex little social codes. So yes, they do make life quite awkward. Yes. But the evidence today is, I think a lot of that's broken down. I just know when I go away on holiday in France, I just don't notice it anymore.
No.
I notice on the contrary that people think I'm rather formal because I was brought up bilingual, but I have much more formal French than they're speaking.
Yeah. How are you doing? You've now left. We think you're getting younger after you.
Well, that's very kind. I'm still climbing mountains. I just back from Scotland a couple of weeks ago. Good. Been annoyed up. I've got some professional work. I've got lots of voluntary trusteeships in Westminster Abbey, quite close to here. Yeah. At the Oxford Centre for Islamic Studies. I chair a thing called the British-Irish Association. Yeah, another link with, as well as being president of the Franco-British.
You're reaching out single-handedly to our nearest neighbours.
Well, actually, I think the relations with our nearest neighbours matter. And that applies to Ireland, just as it does to France. Ireland is different because it's a much smaller country, and in a way you could make the argument that they see their relationship with us as almost existential, actually, because a bit like us in the States, if we sneeze, they get flu. So on the other hand, I think it's a relationship that the UK sometimes neglects and takes for granted when we shouldn't, when in fact we have good friends there with a shared history. And yet complex, but nevertheless, it's one we should work on.
Well, I think Brits were surprised by Ireland taking the side of Brussels against us in the Brexit talks. Well, I mean, you know why that happened.
I do too. Yes,
but it was a surprise culturally. It was like, wow, these are our pals.
Yeah, well, maybe we've neglected them somewhat, but maybe if you rile your pals sufficiently, you shouldn't be surprised if they take a different view.
I've got to ask you one question about this. You mentioned the Oxford Islamic Centre there. You're doing the definition of Islamophobia, looking at that. There's concern about the impact on freedom of speech. You're a very wise barrister. How are you going to, because you're a conservative, you believe in freedom of speech.
I am very much aware of that. And at the outset, I said there is an issue surrounding freedom of expression as against the desire of many Muslims to have some kind of definition which provides a measure of a framework which may help protect them, because they're undoubtedly at the moment the victims of really unpleasant anti-Muslim hatred. Respectable lady travelling with a headscarf on the bus will get casual abuse. And this is driving a wedge in our society that is, in my view, very dangerous. So we're looking at it, but please, I encourage people, look at what we're going to produce is private for government. Look at our terms of reference. They make absolutely explicit that we will not introduce some blasphemy law to protect religion, whether it's Islam or anything else, by the back door, and nor will it have any impact on the recurrent laws in relation to freedom of expression under law. So people should be reassured by that. That's not clear that we will get it all right. And at the end of the day, if the government doesn't like what we want, they won't use it. But we are there to operate within that framework. And some of the stuff I'm reading about this is just, excuse my saying it, garbage.
Yes.
So
good to hear from you saying that. Is it you're conservative? You agree? You believe in freedom?
I believe fundamentally, and as I pointed out to people, I voted to get rid of the blasphemy laws. And what people may not remember was that we also had an act which Blair, the government, brought in to introduce incitement to religious hatred. and we amended it. And we amended it helped by a huge Labour rebellion. And the people who orchestrated that rebellion were David Davis and myself. So, I mean, either I've gone through some extraordinary revolutionary transformation in my views, which I haven't, or I keep that very much in mind in relations to the work we're doing. But none of that should get us away from the fact that there is now a serious problem of a significant section of our society who are getting really unpleasant and just form of demonization.
Yes. And Muslims need this, but Christians don't need one, or definition.
Well, you could make an argument, and some people say, "Why has anybody got definitions?" But we started down this road quite a long time ago. So the question is it helpful in practice? That, to my mind, is what is the key to what we're trying to achieve. As I say, I can't guarantee we will come up with the right solution in case I am the chair and my fellow commissioners have their own views, but we will work that through, and I hope we'll come up with something which is helpful and in the public interest.
This year?
Oh, yes, definitely. I mean, we should be finished in the autumn.
Good. Dominic Grieve, it's been great to see you again on Chopper's Political Podcast. You're my old podcast, now on my new podcast, and with some words of advice, I think, on resetting our relationship with France. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Now, the grooming gang scandal is just getting set up by Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister. He, of course, ordered a U-turn of seeing evidence of the problem from Baroness Casey, following the reporting by Charlie Peters, the GB News reporter. The scope is yet to be established, but one area it might look at is a connection, if there is one, between first cousin marriage in communities in the UK, particularly Pakistani heritage communities, and the grooming gang scandal. Earlier this year, Richard Holden asked this question of the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer.
A marriage between first cousins carries significant health issues, many of which aren't even knowable until post-birth. When practiced generation after generation, there is a significant multiplier effect. In addition, the real impacts for the openness of our society and women's rights in our country are also significant. After all, there are significant dynamics in sharing the same set of grandparents. On Friday, this government has a choice to let my bill go through to ban first cousin marriage to committee stage. Will the Prime Minister think again before instructing his whips to block this legislation?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we've taken our position on that bill. Thank you.
That was Sir Keir Starmer there saying he'd not have any truck with Richard Holden's attempt to try and legally ban first cousin marriage. He's with me now. Richard Holden, why is first cousin marriage an issue you want to fight on?
I think the truth is, Chris, this wasn't something that I knew a huge amount about until last year. I'd actually done some work in the last Parliament on banning so-called hymenoplasty and virginity testing, which was a real issue affecting certain minority communities, women in certain minority communities. And I heard about that on a radio show, bizarrely, several years ago. But we actually got that through in legislation and got those changes to occur. And it was actually reading an article by Matthew Said in the Times, which really brought this issue of cousin marriage home to me. And it struck me in three different ways, really, and this is why I want to ban it. First of all, I think it's horrific for community integration. If people share the same set of grandparents, then actually rather than having people getting married and falling in love and getting married outside of their immediate family, actually what you're doing is almost creating clan structures, which are horrific for integration. But they're also because
walls built around the family.
Walls are totally built around the family. All the financial elements are kept within the family. In fact, when I introduced my 10-minute rule bill on this, the private members bill, the opposition Gaza independent MP who opposed me in it basically said this is one of the main reasons he didn't like it is because actually it's all about keeping families together. The problem is that actually it's not. It's really not conducive to having people as part of a broader society, because then you get married to lots of different people. Actually those family groups they're important, but they're not the whole of society. Whereas actually the dangers with maintaining things within a sort of clan structure, that's a problem.
And so it's Asian families you're talking about, do?
Well, there's not really. No, there's a couple of groups actually. There's a couple of groups. No, it's actually some British Pakistani families, particularly from rural Pakistan. They're the main. That's the biggest issue. There's also an issue with the Irish traveller community as well. where there's a much higher preponderance of this than the general population. And there are certain other, it's very much smaller minority communities where this is also an issue. But the biggest issue is definitely around the British Pakistani community and amongst certain parts of it from certain parts of rural Pakistan.
So critics will say you're doing it because it's a kind of a dog whistle thing to the right. Is that not right? Is that right? Is that grossly unfair? That's certainly how it seemed to me, the way the short shrift you were given.
Well, there was a short. I think there's a real issue with the Prime Minister's response on this, and actually some of Labour's response as well. The truth is, I think, is that we're looking at three different things. One is around this integration piece. I want to see these communities integrated into British society. There's nothing. Actually, the most racist thing you can possibly do is say you can only marry people who you're related to. Right? I mean, that is literally that is almost the definition of racism. I'm literally the total opposite end of that. I want to see people get married, fall in love, have kids with people from whatever background, but across society. I don't want to see people trapped in clan structures. That's about the integration point. The second point is around personal freedom. Roughly around, in some of these communities, up to 80%, and it has been as high as 80% in some of these communities, getting married to first cousins. Right, that is an absolute nightmare. It means there's no freedom of choice over who you're getting married to. Your life is predetermined by your grandparents, essentially.
And the couples don't want to marry each other?
Well, it's quite clear. In general society, roughly 1 in 500 couples are first cousins, right? In these communities, it can be up to 400 out of 500, right? That tells you, actually, this isn't about choice, right? This is about compulsion. And we've passed legislation over the last few years. The Conservatives, when in government, we raised the age of we could get married from 16 to 18. We also passed legislation in addition to what I did about hymenoplasty and virginity testing. We also passed legislation to stop people being parts of forced marriages. I think this is basically forced marriages. A lot of these, and the support I've got from within the community has actually been quite substantial. A lot of people don't put their heads above the parapet, understandably so. But even in that YouGov poll we saw a few weeks ago,
and quite like briefly, that's showing that 77% of Brits are in favour of a ban, 9% oppose it.
But even that poll was really interesting. Even with the British Pakistani and Bangladeshi community, a majority supported a ban. Which goes to show that there's actually large parts of the community who understand this is an issue, right? Who want to see it banned as well. So actually, if you're saying me, right, and you're absolutely right on your question, is the racist thing to do in this situation would be to ignore the majority of the British Pakistani and Bangladeshi community and say, no, we know better. And I think there's some of these woke warriors who decide actually that cultural relativism is okay across the board. I mean, when you're looking at, as I said, integration, the main first point. Secondly, it's all about individual freedom and the freedom to marry and fall in love with who you want to. And the third point, I think, is around these health concerns as well. There are clearly big issues around first cousin marriage. There are issues if it's just in genetic concerns, and some of which can be found out in advance, a lot of which cannot be found out in advance, particularly when it comes to some of those gastrointestinal issues. And you go to some of our biggest children's hospitals in the UK. You could go there today, Chris, and you would see a very significant number of the people in there, the children in there, are there because of these of marriages which are too close between family members.
You mentioned the journalist Matthew Syed. He wrote a very, very interesting piece in June in the Sunday Times. He linked the issue of cousin marriage with the rape gangs scandal. Now, can you explain why these two things are connected or could be connected?
Well, look, Matthew. Let's just remember that Matthew is also half British Pakistani himself, right? So he's coming at this from that background. I think it's also important just to reflect on this is that what we saw with the grooming and rape gangs was actually basically a clan structure protecting itself. So there was often these gangs were of extended family members, so uncles and nephews. Often many of them will be in these clans which have got huge amounts of first cousin and second cousin intermarriage within them, which means actually if you go against or try and speak out against what's happening, you're not just leaving your friendship circle or people who you grew up with. You're leaving your entire family, the entire support structure you've got there, which is exactly the same reason that I'm looking to ban first cousin marriage overall. Is because if you and me, Chris, were told that, or say if we had children, right, and we're literally telling them they've got to get married to their and you share the same sort of grandparents, how can you ever leave that family structure? You can't leave because all of your family, all of your friends, right, all interconnected. So if you the pressure of staying within that structure is so intense, and I'm absolutely convinced, as Matthew Said said in the Times, that actually it's some of these structures, these clan-based structures, which actually prevented a lot of these issues and these abuses being out there.
The offenders viewed the white girls they were raping in a different way.
I think a combination of
because they raped, the victims weren't in the clans. The clans there was of.
I think you're absolutely right. A combination of both those things. One, yes, they view the victims as other and outside of the family network, so having less value. And secondly, obviously, when issues do come to a head and people, do want to speak out, actually they won't speak out because speaking out doesn't just mean, snitching on your friends. Doesn't even, it means snitching on your entire community and your entire network. And often the financial relationships here are very, very deep as well, because of the, you will have families who loan money to each other. Where there's huge amounts of notional shared wealth,
the dowry involved.
There's all sorts of elements involved in it. There is, yeah.
This wasn't raised in the Baroness Casey Blackstock report, widely praised for forcing the government to do a U-turn and order this rape gangs inquiry. We yet to see the shape of that by then. Of course, my colleague at GB News, Charlie Peters, has done a lot of important reporting on this. Have you taken your issue about first cousin marriage to Baroness Casey, Lou's Casey?
Yeah, I think there is an issue here, and actually Baroness Casey does reference within her report some of the close family networks, but sort of dismisses them. She sort of dismisses them in her report, and I worry about that because. Actually, yes, she said there were some family connections amongst some of the perpetrators, but there weren't formalised structures. Well, I don't know what is more of a formalised structure in our society than marriage and family, right? And to me, it was a bit of a blind spot. So it's something I have written to her about. I think it is an issue. And I think it's something that needs to be looked into, because if you do have these, as you said, and she was very clear about the fact that there was sort of othering within parts of the British Pakistani community of these white girls, but I don't think she also recognised just how important some of these clan structures can be in actually preventing then
and why it's allowed to carry on.
And why it's allowed to carry on.
Which is this decade. It's through the Tory government.
It is, and it also a lot of it happens in a sort of below the surface level. People won't speak up, and we look, Chris. We just need to think about what happened with some of these sex issues, and child abuse issues in the 50s, 60s, 70s, right around some of the Catholic Church and some other institutions, right? A lot of this happened because communities were trapped within themselves, wouldn't speak out. And anybody who was seen to speak out was speaking out against the community. And the truth is that within these communities, people know this is wrong. They want to see it change. And the polls show they want to see it change. We've got a Labour government who are just so insensitive to the bigger issue that they're tied to some of these community leaders.
Let's not get political about it. It's too important for that, I think, this one. It is a bit political. But
there are political elements to this.
But it's not entirely a wall of avoiding the issue for Labour.
That is fair.
People in the government, I think you've said.
You're quite right. I think there is. I think you're sorry, and I should have been very clear about this. I have had behind the scenes in those sort of conversations that MPs have outside of the sort of theatre of the House of Commons. There are MPs and female ministers as well, multiple, who've come up to me and said, "Richard, keep going, keep doing what you're doing. This is really important."
Can you name them now?
No, I'm not going to name. No, I'm not going to name them because
they get a hard time.
Because it would be unfair to do so. But there are female ministers in this government who are very, very keen on this because they can see what's happening in their communities. They can see young women either from the UK getting married to men, first cousins from Pakistan who don't speak English, or vice versa. Young women from Pakistan being married to men in the UK. And actually, it's not just on the women's side; it's also young men who don't want to get involved in these relationships too, and they can see it being forced in their communities. And this is where I think there is a part of a political issue for the Labour Party at the moment, is that they are in a difficult spot around how they deal with the British parts of the British Pakistani Muslim community, because traditionally they've seen them as their voters. And we saw what happened at the last election with the so-called Gaza independence. And there is a fight within the Labour Party for what is a short-term political, we've got to stick with some of these community leaders, and a long-term, which I would view political advantage, which is to say, actually, to the younger people in these communities, and actually the majority of people in these communities, right? Actually, let's get with the programme. Let's actually break some of these clan structures. Let's open it up. Let's allow people to integrate into British society. Let's allow freedom to occur within these communities, and let's also at the same time address some of these health issues, which also have massive impacts for people in these families, particularly women.
Some bravery.
It would take some bravery
and some backbone.
It would, yes, yeah. It would, and I grew up in these areas, right? I grew up in Blackburn, and in the north of England, and I grew up with some of these, some of the kids who, were being forced down some of these channels, and I also at the same time as in the early 2000s was campaigning against the BNP in these communities as well. So so I'm in this. It's a difficult situation to be in sometimes when you really want this community, parts of these communities. I've still got friends in now. You want to see them break out of themselves in some way, and I think there is there's some real positivity that could happen from this, and I think it's time for the government to show the lead.
Richard Holden, thank you for joining us today on Chopper's Political Podcast. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Richard Holden, thank you, and thank you earlier to Dominic Grieve. What do you think of this podcast? Have you enjoyed it? Do you want to become a closer ami with our French cousins? Is it a case of vive la différence? Let me know. I tweet at Christopher Hope on X. Email me, chopper@gbnews.uk. I want to hear what you think about this podcast, and we'll do our best with my worker bees to improve it. If you enjoyed this show, please do tell your friends. If you really enjoyed it, leave us a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and anywhere else you find this podcast. That helps other people to find the show and keeps it going. Thank the great team of GB News colleagues behind the show, Mick Booker and Jeff Marsh, back at the mothership of GB News in Paddington, and the podcast's busy worker bees collecting news pollen for GB News here in Westminster, Rebecca Nunes and George Macmillan. And they are in the studio listening to this conversation. Most importantly of all, thank you again for listening. If you want more Chopper in your life, and who doesn't, they do, please catch me during the week on GB News with our latest political stories and scoops and our best reporting for you. And do go to our website, gbnews.com, for our best reporting for all of our agenda, our news agenda at GB News. Until next time now, au revoir. Cheerio.